He had the power to shape destiny, to rewrite the rules of humanity. But what happens when that power falls into the hands of someone who believes himself to be justice incarnate? Is he a visionary savior, the herald of a new era of order, or a harbinger of the most profound destruction? Prepare for a dizzying dive into the mind of a genius who crossed the fine line between the purest idealism and the most absolute darkness. Discover that vanity can be the most lethal of weapons, capable of corroding the soul and transforming the noblest of intentions into an overwhelming obsession. In a modern, apathetic Japan, saturated by a crime rate that seemed to multiply uncontrollably, lived Light Yagami. An exceptionally brilliant student, endowed with a sharp intellect, impeccable logical reasoning, and a sense of justice that, for many, bordered on obsession. His environment was one of high academic performance, where excellence was the norm, but also of a growing disillusionment with the legal system. Light saw the system as ineffective, complacent, and ultimately, flawed in its ability to protect the innocent and punish transgressors. His days were filled with school routine, but his mind constantly seethed with the iniquity he witnessed in the news and daily reports. He dreamed, with an almost palpable intensity, of a purified world, where offenders would be severely held accountable for their actions, and order, finally, would be restored. It was amidst this latent dissatisfaction, almost a silent fire, that the unexpected manifested itself. A notebook, with a dark cover and an enigmatic name etched on its surface, mysteriously appeared in his path. In it, a shocking and unbelievable premise: any name written in that notebook would result in the dissipation of that person's life. Initially, Light vehemently doubted it, considering it a bad joke, perhaps an elaborate hoax. However, the force of his innate curiosity, coupled with his existential boredom and his burning desire for a more forceful and immediate justice, led him to test the artifact. The results were not only shocking but immediately and undeniably real. The criminals, whose names he had, with a mixture of skepticism and a dangerous fascination, jotted down, had their paths abruptly and inexplicably cut short. This moment of discovery was not just the revelation of a power, but the activation of the first crucial psychological trait in Light: latent narcissism. That notebook was not simply a tool for justice. It was, for Light, an irrefutable confirmation of his intellectual and moral superiority. He, Light Yagami, was the only one capable of wielding such power righteously, for the supreme good of humanity. He began to believe himself, with growing conviction, a divine agent, the chosen one to purify a corrupt world. Psychoanalysis, here, could point to the activation of a superiority complex, where the possession of extraordinary power feeds the unwavering belief of being special, of being above the common rules that govern society. This was the foundation of the world Light would begin to build, a world where he saw himself as the sole legislator, judge, and executioner. But there was something, a growing shadow, that no one saw coming, a silent distortion in his own soul. The point of no return for Light did not manifest as a conventional trauma, but rather as the overwhelming revelation of his absolute and unrestrained power. The true trigger was the visceral perception that he, and he alone, held supreme control over existence and the dissipation of life. This epiphany not only transformed his existential boredom into a grand purpose but also transmuted his initial disillusionment into a messianic crusade. Light began to see himself not merely as an enforcer of the law, but as the very embodiment of divine justice, the unquestionable architect of a new era of purity and order. Light's transformation was an insidious, gradual, but relentless process. Initially, he scrupulously limited himself to the most notorious criminals, those whose transgressions were unquestionable and widely publicized. However, as the number of disappearances increased exponentially, so did his self-confidence and, dangerously, his sense of impunity. Internal conflict, if it existed in any significant way, was minimal. The rationalization of his actions was almost instantaneous, perfect in its twisted logic. He wasn't taking lives, he was, in his mind, cleaning the world, creating a utopia, where evil could no longer thrive. Externally, the emergence of the mysterious Kira, as the media dubbed him, a name that became a whisper of terror and hope, generated a complex mixture of fear and fascination, dividing public opinion between those who saw him as a providential savior and those who considered him a nefarious threat to the very essence of humanity. Social psychology, at this point, could explain this transformation through the theory of de-individuation, where the anonymity conferred by power and the perception of being invincible lead to behaviors that, under normal circumstances, would be unacceptable and morally reprehensible. Light, hidden behind the mask of Kira, felt disconnected from the moral and ethical norms that governed ordinary society. His mind, previously focused on studies and mundane aspirations, was now completely immersed in the intricate logistics of his mission. Ethics were a fluid concept for him, shaped and reshaped at his convenience and according to his designs. His ability to manipulate and justify his actions, even the most questionable and brutal, was a chilling testament to his evolving mind, or, more precisely, his distortion. He operated with a coldness that defied comprehension, creating a new reality where his rules were the only law. And it was there, at that turning point, that everything began to crumble, not for the world, but for Light's own soul. Light's mind, once a beacon of intelligence and promise, now became a complex and terrifying labyrinth of ruthless strategies and distorted justifications. He was no longer merely an exceptionally gifted student, he was, in his own perception, a god in ascension, and every act of cleansing was a fundamental brick in the construction of his empire of justice. Facts, words, and attitudes revealed, with disturbing clarity, the depth of this new and dark way of thinking. Light planned each interruption with chilling meticulousness, anticipating every move of the authorities, weaving an intricate web of manipulations that made him almost unreachable. He was not content to be a mere executioner, he desired, with a feverish intensity, to be the supreme architect of the perfect society, a world molded in his own image and likeness. For Light, the transgressions of others were no longer just crimes to be punished. They were, in his distorted view, impurities that needed to be ruthlessly eradicated. His internal monologues, and sometimes external utterances when he felt completely secure, reflected a growing contempt for the imperfection inherent in the human condition. This world is rotten to the core, he thought with icy conviction. I will be the cure, the scalpel that will excise evil. His demeanor became visibly more cold, more calculating, and his vanity inflated to the point of not recognizing limits or flaws in his own logic. Empathy, if he ever fully possessed it, was supplanted and obliterated by unbridled arrogance and the unwavering certainty of his own superiority. To draw the audience into Light's mind, to experience the vertigo of his reasoning, we can use the analogy of the Lucifer effect, which explores how initially good people can be led to commit morally reprehensible and even brutal acts under certain conditions. Light, vested with unlimited power and fueled by the belief in a grand and messianic purpose, became tragically susceptible to this transformation. His mental processes were frighteningly similar to those of an elite military strategist, but instead of armies, he manipulated human lives. Cognitive dissonance was practically non-existent in his mind, he eliminated any thought that contradicted his inflexible vision of justice. His targets were dehumanized, reduced to mere obstacles on his path to the utopia he envisioned. Humanity, to him, was a game of chess, and he, the sole player. But the true monster, the darkest essence of his soul, was still dormant, awaiting the moment of its full manifestation. The act of total transgression for Light Yagami was not a singular, isolated event, but a series of calculated and irreversible steps that irrevocably distanced him from his original humanity. He crossed the point of no return when he began to direct his power not only against notorious criminals but also against those who dared to oppose his vision of justice, including investigators who were on his trail and even innocent individuals who, by chance, hindered his meticulously elaborated plans. Light's worldview completely changed, he was no longer a student seeking to punish evil. He was, in his mind, the only infallible arbiter of right and wrong, the only being capable of determining humanity's fate. Morality and ethics, once pillars of human conduct, became malleable, plastic concepts in Light's hands, shaped and reshaped at his own convenience. He rationalized each of his actions, no matter how heinous, as an imperative necessity for the greater good, for the construction of a crime-free world. His logic was, to him, impeccable. If the elimination of a few individuals was strictly necessary to achieve a utopian and crime-free society, then these acts, however violent, were fully justified. He argued, with chilling conviction, that by getting rid of the undesirable elements of society, he was saving millions of lives and paving the way for a peaceful and ideal future. The viewer is then forced to confront a deeply disturbing ethical dilemma: what if he's right? The desire for a world without crime, without suffering, without injustice, is a universally shared longing. The crucial question, however, lies in the price to be paid. Light firmly believed that the end justified the means, no matter how dark and cruel those means were. His mind became a bastion of self-justification, where doubt was a luxury he could not, under any circumstances, afford. This escalation of power and the subsequent moral corruption lead to the unsettling question: what happens when the hero, driven by extreme idealism, becomes what he swore to destroy? And what makes us think that we ourselves wouldn't cross the fine line if we had such power in our hands? The fragility of human morality is exposed, and the abyss between intention and consequence becomes terrifying. Delving deeper into Light's psychological analysis, it is possible to observe a progressive and alarming manifestation of megalomania and a clear narcissistic personality disorder in its most extreme form. His actions, though morally reprehensible and universally condemned, made a disturbing sense within his own distorted and self-justified logic. For Light, there was absolutely no madness in his actions. There was, in his mind, a cold, relentless, and mathematically precise logic, an arithmetic of justice, where the equation was always solved by the merciless elimination of the undesirables, those who, in his view, tainted the purity of the world. Studies on the Dunning-Kruger effect can be invoked to illustrate and validate Light's behavior. This effect describes how individuals with low competence in certain areas tend to grossly overestimate their own abilities. In Light's case, his exceptional intelligence led him to a dangerous overestimation of his moral competence and his ability to judge and decide the fate of other human beings. He saw himself as omniscient and omnipotent, qualities that psychology points to as delusions of grandeur in extreme cases of personality disorders. He believed himself infallible in his judgments and irrefutable in his executions. Comparisons can be drawn with other fictional characters who succumbed to the temptation of power, or even with historical figures who, vested with great authority, fell into the trap of imposing their own worldview, often resulting in catastrophic and widely destructive outcomes. The crucial and terrifying point is that Light's mind did not operate under the same moral and ethical precepts that govern most societies. He created a particular value system, a unique code of conduct, where he was the compass, the map, and the final destination. He was not a madman, he was a precise calculator, a meticulous strategist. It wasn't madness. It was cold calculation. What remains after Light's dark journey is not a purified and utopian society, but a world deeply marked by paranoia, distrust, and persistent uncertainty. The rise and fall of Kira shaped the social environment in profound, irreversible, and complex ways. The fear of the sudden dissipation of life came to hang not only over offenders but also over those who might be wrongly judged by an invisible and omniscient power. Crime, indeed, drastically decreased, but this reduction came at the cost of individual freedom, trust in traditional justice institutions, and, fundamentally, the very essence of humanity. The consequences, both real within the narrative and fictional with echoes in our own world, are vast and multifaceted. Society became more vigilant, yes, but also more divided, more polarized. The thin line between the pursuit of security and totalitarian oppression became dangerously frayed. People questioned, and continue to question, the role of punishment, the true essence of evil, the limits of power, and the nature of justice itself. This intense and disturbing journey of Light brings a crucial and timeless philosophical and moral reflection: who are we to judge with such finality? And who are we to grant any individual the power to decide over the existence or non-existence of others? Like Yagami's story concludes with an impactful ending, but the cycle of questions and moral dilemmas remains. The idea of a perfect world, purified by a single individual, however noble the intention may seem, is appealing, but the inherent risks are immense, and the price to be paid can be the very soul of society. The obsession with absolute justice can corrode humanity from within, transforming the liberator into a tyrant. But perhaps, he was not the last to dream of such power, to covet such absolute control, and perhaps humanity will still have to face, repeatedly, the dark temptation of a new Kira, a new herald of a distorted order. The world would never be the same after Kira's passage. The seed of doubt had been deeply planted in the soil of collective consciousness, and the question hung in the air, cold and uncomfortable: can justice, in its purest and most implacable form, be entrusted to a single individual, no matter how brilliant he may be, no matter how well-intentioned he declares himself? Or is the price of such absolute power the very soul of humanity, corroded by arrogance and the illusion of omnipotence? His story reminds us, with painful clarity, that the line between light and darkness, between righteousness and perversion, is thinner and more dangerous than we imagine. And that the greatest threat to our existence may not come from explicit evil, but from vanity that cunningly disguises itself as good, promising salvation while paving the way for ruin.